The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late October dust, diesel exhaust, and the bittersweet smell of a family's life being sold off piece by piece. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my canvas work coat, the worn fabric a familiar comfort against my calloused knuckles. My name's Cal Thompson, and auctions like this were becoming a regular part of my calendar in the fall of '71. Not to buy land, I had my 320 acres, free and clear, just like my father left it, but to watch, to learn, and maybe to pick up a bargain on some forgotten piece of iron. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as a brand-new Ford pickup, gleaming candy apple red, pulled up and parked where no one else dared, right on the edge of the manicured lawn. Dale Miller stepped out, looking more like a salesman from Des Moines than a farmer. He wore polished boots, creased blue jeans, and a jacket with the logo of the new Pioneer seed corn stitched over the breast. He didn't walk. He strode, clapping men on the back, his laugh a little too loud, his confidence a tangible force that made the other farmers shift their weight and look down at their muddy boots. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Jed, was working his way through the smaller items: wrenches in greasy buckets, old fence stretchers, a stack of used tires. Then he got to the main event, the land. 160 acres of prime, black Iowa dirt that bordered Miller's ever-expanding empire. "All right, folks, you know the piece," Jed chanted, his voice a hypnotic rhythm. "Section 14, 160 acres of the finest ground in the county. What'll you give? Who'll start me at 200 an acre?" 200? Do I hear 200? The bidding started slow, a few local boys trying to get a foothold, but it was a fool's errand. Miller stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He let the others tire themselves out, pushing the price up in $50 increments. When it stalled at 450, Miller's voice cut through the air like a blade. 500. A collective sigh went through the crowd. That was it. He hadn't just raised the bid, he'd made a statement. The other bidders shook their heads and stepped back. 500 going once, twice. Sold to Mr. Dale Miller for $500 an acre. Miller didn't even smile. He just nodded to the clerk, another piece of the county map colored in with his name. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres now, all of it bought on credit, all of it worked with the biggest, newest machinery money could buy. He'd stop by the co-op and talk about leverage and depreciation schedules, words that made my father's generation nervous. To them, debt was a sickness. To Miller, it was fuel. Jed moved the crowd along to the equipment line, a decent John Deere 4020, much like my own but a few years newer, went for a premium. A six-bottom plow followed. Then, at the very end of the line, tucked behind a rusted-out grain truck, was the reason I was really here. It was a Massey Ferguson 760 combine. When it was new, it had been the king of the field, a monster with a huge grain tank and a wide header. But this one was a ghost. A fire had ripped through the engine compartment. The big Perkins V8 was a blackened, melted hulk of iron. Soot stained the yellow paint all the way up the side, and the cab glass on the right was a spiderweb of cracks. The tires were flat, the sheet metal was warped, and a sad, defeated air hung over it. Jed looked at it and sighed. "Well, folks, here she is. Lot 247. As is. Where is? Good for scrap, I suppose. Who'll give me $100 for the scrap iron? $100 to haul her away?" The crowd chuckled. A few men kicked the flat tires and shook their heads. Miller, standing nearby, let out a loud laugh. "Better call the scrapper yourself, Jed. That thing's a boat anchor. You'd spend more on diesel dragging it to the yard than you'd get for it." More laughter. I felt a slow burn in my chest. I'd seen this machine before the fire, seen it working Henderson's fields. I knew its bones. While they saw a wreck, I saw a heavy-duty frame, a massive set of final drives, and a separator system that was barely used. The fire was bad, but it was contained to the engine bay. The heart was dead, but the body was sound. "Do I hear 50? Jed pleaded. $50. Silence. I took a deep breath and stepped forward from the back of the crowd. Every eye turned to me. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden hush. 100. Jed's eyebrows shot up. Miller turned and stared at me, his mouth agape, a look of pure disbelief on his face. He looked me up and down, taking in my worn coat and my grease-stained hands. A local scrap dealer, a fellow named Gus, piped up. 150. He'd make a profit at that price, easily. 200, I said, my eyes locked on the machine, not on Gus or Miller. I could feel the whispers rippling through the crowd. Cal Thompson's lost his mind. What's he going to do with that? Gus shrugged and shook his head. He was out. Jed, looking thrilled to get anything at all, sped up his chant. $200, do I hear 250? 200 going once, going twice. Sold. To Cal Thompson for $200. The gavel fell with a crack that sounded as loud as a gunshot. For a moment, there was just the sound of the wind rustling the dry corn stalks in the field beyond. Then Miller started to clap, a slow, mocking applause. "Well, congratulations, Cal," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as I walked toward the clerk's table. "You just bought yourself the most expensive piece of yard art in the county. What in God's name are you going to do with that thing? Plant flowers in the grain tank?" I stopped and looked him square in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Gonna make it run, Dale." He just laughed, a deep, booming laugh that made his cronies join in. "Make it run? With what? A book of matches and a prayer? You can't afford the paint to cover the scorch marks, let alone a new engine for that beast." I just gave him a small nod, paid the clerk my $200 in cash, and walked back toward my old pickup. I could feel their eyes on my back the whole way. Let them laugh. They saw a pile of junk. I saw a challenge. I saw a future. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this thing, I've got to ask you all a question. Have you ever taken a chance on something everyone else called worthless? A rusty old truck, a broken-down piece of equipment, something you found in a barn that just needed some love and a lot of hard work. Drop a comment below and tell me about that one project you took on that everyone else said was a fool's errand. I'd sure like to hear about it. Getting that combine home was a battle in itself. It was a dead weight, all 20,000 pounds of it. I brought my 4020 over, the old tractor's two-cylinder diesel engine, popping and barking a familiar rhythm. Pop, pop, bang, pop. It was a sound of reliability, a sound I trusted. I spent a whole afternoon with a portable air compressor and a bucket of tire plugs, getting the massive tires to hold enough air to roll. They were cracked and weather-checked, but they'd have to do for now. Hitching it up was another story. I used a thick log chain, doubled up and hooked to the combine's heavy front axle. The 40-20 strained, its rear tires digging into the dirt, the engine's governor opening up with a deep, throaty roar. Slowly, grudgingly, the Massey lurched forward. The 5-mile trip back to my farm took the better part of 3 hours. Every time I hit a small incline, the 4020 would squat down, smoke rolling from its exhaust stack as it fought for traction. People slowed their cars down to stare, to point. I could see them talking, shaking their heads. By the time I pulled into my own lane, word had already spread all over the county. I parked the mechanical carcass next to my machine shed. a monument to what everyone else considered my foolishness. For the next few weeks, it just sat there. I had my own harvest to finish, my own corn and beans to get out of the field. I did it with my John Deere 95, a little combine by miller's standards, but it was mine. I knew every belt, every chain, every bearing on that machine. When the feeder house chain jumped a sprocket one afternoon, I didn't have to call a dealer and wait for a mechanic. I shut her down, climbed in with a couple of wrenches and a pry bar, and had it fixed and running again in under an hour. I finished my harvest a week after Miller finished his, but my grain went into my own bins, not to the elevator to pay off a note on a new machine. Once the crops were in and the fall tillage was done, I turned my full attention to the Massey. The first order of business was to get a clear look at the damage. I spent 2 days with a power washer, blasting away layers of soot, melted rubber, and oily grime. Underneath the black crust, the engine was a nightmare. The aluminum intake manifold had melted into a puddle. The wiring harness was a fused glob of copper and plastic. The fuel lines were brittle, charred tubes. It was worse than I thought. The real work began with the teardown. I unbolted the sheet metal panels, the ones that weren't warped beyond recognition, and laid them out on the ground. I hooked my chain hoist to the rafters in the shop, backed the combine in as far as it would go, and prepared to pull the engine. That Perkins V8 was a heavy beast. Every bolt fought me, seized with rust and heat. I soaked them in penetrating oil, heated them with a torch until they glowed cherry red, and leaned on a 4-foot breaker bar with every ounce of my strength. More than one bolt sheared off with a sharp crack, leaving me to drill out the stub and retap the hole. My knuckles were bloody, my back ached, and I went to bed every night smelling of burnt oil and scorched metal. After a week of struggle, the engine was finally free. I lowered it onto a heavy-duty dolly and rolled it out into the light. It was a post-mortem. I pulled the heads and found scored cylinder walls. The heat had been so intense it had cooked the oil in the pan to a thick tar and warped the block itself. Miller was right about one thing. This engine was scrap iron. The community scorn was a constant low hum in the background of my life. At the feed mill, the men would stop talking when I walked in. At the diner, conversations would pick up again once I was seated in my corner booth. But I'd catch the glances, the smirks. Dale Miller was the worst. He never missed an opportunity. "Heard you're performing surgery out there, Cal," he'd say loudly, so everyone could hear. "You get that boat anchor running yet? Or are you still trying to figure out which end the key goes in?" I never gave him the satisfaction of a response. I'd just sip my coffee and look out the window. My father had a saying, "An empty wagon makes the most noise." Dale Miller's wagon was rattling fit to beat the band, but his words and the quiet judgment of my neighbors were like stones in my pocket. They were a weight I carried every day. My only respite was in the work itself, in the solitary confines of my machine shed, where the only opinions that mattered were the tolerances in a service manual and the solid feel of a properly torqued bolt. The search for a new engine became an obsession. This was long before the internet. My tools were the telephone and the classifieds in the back of farm magazines. I spent hours on the phone, calling every salvage yard from Omaha to Peoria. Most of them laughed when I told them what I was looking for. A Perkins V8 diesel, model 540. It was an uncommon engine, powerful, but known for being thirsty. Finally, a call to a yard down in southern Missouri paid off. "Yeah, got one?" the gravelly voice on the other end said. "Came out of a white truck that rolled over. Low miles, but it ain't cheap." The price he quoted made my stomach clench. It was more than I'd made in the last 2 months. but it was the heart I needed for my machine. I drove down the next weekend in my old pickup, a 6-hour trip each way. The engine was sitting on a pallet, covered in a dusty tarp. It was bigger than I remembered, a true industrial powerhouse. I paid the man in cash, money I had saved, money that wasn't borrowed from a bank. We loaded it with a forklift, and the old Ford sagged on its springs all the way home. The next phase of the project was fabrication. The engine from the truck had a different bell housing pattern and different motor mounts. I spent the rest of that winter in my shop, turning from a farmer into a machinist. I bought 1/4-inch steel plate and cut it with a torch, grinding the edges smooth. I measured, remeasured, and drilled holes with my big drill press, the bit screaming as it bit into the thick steel. I welded the new mounts together, laying down careful beads, the bright arc of the welder lighting up my little shop late into the night. It was slow, painstaking work. There were no instructions. I was figuring it out as I went, using nothing but logic and a feel for the metal. By the time the snows of winter began to melt, I had the new engine sitting in the combine's frame, bolted down solid on mounts I had made with my own 2 hands. The years from 1972 to 1974 were like a gold rush for farmers in the heartland. A massive grain sale to the Soviet Union sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been $1.50 a bushel, suddenly shot past $3. Soybeans went from $3 to over $6. For the first time in a generation, there was real money to be made in farming, and it changed everything. The mood in the county turned from cautious optimism to outright euphoria. The banks, flush with cash, were loaning money at what seemed like reasonable rates. The phrase on everyone's lips was, "Get big or get out." And no one got bigger, faster than Dale Miller. The high prices and easy credit were like gasoline on the fire of his ambition. He bought another quarter section that bordered his land, this time paying an unheard-of $700 an acre. He traded in his nearly new international harvester, Ofteriana 6, for a brand-new Steiger Panther, a massive 4-wheel drive articulated tractor that looked like it belonged on a construction site. It was the first one in the county. He'd drive it down the main road just to show it off, the dual wheels on all 4 corners making the pavement tremble. He bought a new, bigger Gleaner combine, a silver monster that could chew through 8 rows of corn at a time. His farm was no longer a farm. It was an operation, a showcase of the latest, most powerful technology. He and his wife took a vacation to Hawaii that winter. He drove a new Lincoln. She drove a new Cadillac. At the diner, he'd talk about his expansion plans, about how land was the one thing they weren't making any more of, and how a man would be a fool not to buy all he could while the getting was good. "You got to spend money to make money," he'd say, looking right at me. And the other farmers, their pockets full of cash for the first time in their lives, would nod in agreement. They were trading in their old 4020s for new John Deere Soundguard tractors with air conditioning and radios. The local dealership couldn't keep them in stock. Meanwhile, I stuck to my plan. The good prices were a blessing, to be sure. I sold my grain at the peak and had more money in my savings account at the bank than my father had seen in his entire lifetime. But I didn't change a thing about how I lived or how I farmed. I still drove my old pickup. I still worked my land with my paid-for 4020, and every spare dollar and every spare hour went into the Massey Ferguson. With the engine mounted, the real tedious work began. I had to build an entire wiring harness from scratch. I bought huge spools of different colored wire, a proper crimping tool, and a stack of wiring diagrams I'd ordered from a Massey dealer. I spent hundreds of hours on my back, or contorted inside the machine's guts, running wires, crimping connectors, and wrapping them in loom. It was like weaving a complex metal tapestry. One wrong connection, and I could fry the whole system. Then came the hydraulics. The fire had cooked the seals in many of the hoses and cylinders. I took them apart one by one, cleaning the components in a parts washer until they gleamed, and replacing every single O-ring and seal. I bought a new hydraulic hose in bulk and spent days cutting it to length and crimping on new ends. The progress was agonizingly slow. I'd spend a whole weekend working and feel like I'd gotten nowhere. Miller would drive by my place, his big new Steiger pulling a 24-foot disc, and finish his fall tillage in a single afternoon. It took me 3 days with my smaller equipment. In the eyes of the community, the gap between us was no longer a gap. It was a chasm. He was a visionary, a captain of industry. I was the crazy old bachelor, the fool tinkering with a piece of junk while the world passed him by. They didn't see the cash in my bank account. They only saw the rust on my equipment. They didn't see the progress in my shop. They only saw the burnt-out hulk sitting in my yard. I was a failure in their eyes, a relic of a bygone era. By the harvest of 1974, the Massey was starting to look like a combine again. I had fabricated new sheet metal to replace the worst of the warped panels. I'd found a good cab door and window glass at a salvage yard. I'd even given it a coat of paint, not a fancy professional job, but a solid coat of Massey Ferguson yellow, applied with a spray gun in my shed. It covered the last of the scorch marks. From a distance, it almost looked new. But it still wasn't ready. As I was finishing my harvest with the old, reliable John Deere 95, a hydraulic line on the header lift blew. It was a simple fix, but it cost me half a day. As I lay in the corn stubble, hydraulic oil dripping on my face, I watched Miller's new gleaner working in the field across the road. It moved with an implacable, steady roar, devouring corn at a rate I could only dream of. He finished his field, folded up his header, and thundered past me on the road, leaving me in a cloud of dust. He didn't even wave. That winter, I went to the bank to pay off my small operating loan for the seed and fertilizer I'd bought in the spring. I always paid it off in full at the end of the year. The loan officer, a young man named Peterson, seemed surprised. "You know, Cal, you're the only one of my farm clients who does this anymore," he said, stamping my note, "Paid in full. Everyone else is just paying the interest and rolling the principal into a bigger note for next year. Expanding. My dad always said, 'The banker is your partner when the sun is shining, but he's your landlord when it rains,'" I replied, folding the receipt and putting it in my wallet. Peterson gave me a polite, condescending smile. "Times have changed, Cal. With inflation running the way it is, the smart money is in debt. You're paying back loans with cheaper dollars. It's the only way to get ahead." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I was just looking at the news wire before you came in. The Federal Reserve is talking about raising interest rates again to try and cool things down." He said it casually, like he was talking about the weather. But a cold knot formed in my stomach. I looked out the bank window at the grey November sky. The wind was picking up, rattling the glass. It felt like the edge of a storm, the kind of storm that could blow a man's whole world away if his roots weren't deep enough. I nodded to Peterson, thanked him, and walked out into the cold air. Back in my shop, under the steady glow of the incandescent bulbs, I looked at the massive machine that had consumed 3 years of my life. It was almost ready, and I had a feeling I was going to need it. The spring of 1975 was the first sign. It came in dry. The winter snows had been thin, a mere dusting that melted and vanished without ever soaking the subsoil. We planted corn in dust. The planter discs kicked up fine, brown clouds that hung in the air for hours, coating everything in a gritty film. By June, the corn should have been waist-high and a deep, glossy green. Instead, it was stunted and pale, the leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture they held. The sky remained a hard, unforgiving blue, day after day. The talk at the diner shifted. The euphoric chatter about land prices and new equipment was replaced by worried murmurs about the forecast. Dale Miller, who usually held court, was quieter. He had more acres burning up under that relentless sun than anyone else. His input costs were staggering. The seed for 3,000 acres, the fertilizer, the fuel for that giant Steiger tractor. He needed a bumper crop just to break even on his payments. A drought was a catastrophe he couldn't afford. I felt the pressure too. Every farmer did. But my situation was different. My land was paid for. My operating loan was a fraction of his. I watched my own corn struggle and felt a familiar tightness in my chest, but it wasn't the cold panic I saw in the eyes of my neighbors. It was a calculated concern, a problem to be managed, not a looming disaster. That summer, while the crops withered, I put the final touches on the Massey. I bled the hydraulic systems, tightened every belt, and filled the big fuel tank for the first time. The moment of truth came on a blistering July afternoon. I climbed into the cab, the seat I'd reupholstered myself feeling firm beneath me. I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the big V8 over slowly at first, then faster. I gave it a little shot of ether, just to help it along. The engine caught with a sudden, explosive roar, and a column of black smoke billowed from the new exhaust stack I'd welded together. It settled into a deep, rumbling idle, a powerful, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the steel frame and up into the soles of my boots. It was the sound of life, of power I had built with my own hands. I engaged the separator, and the whole machine came alive with a symphony of whirring shafts and rattling chains. It worked. After nearly 4 years, it worked. The first real crack in Miller's empire appeared that fall, during the harvest. The drought had slashed yields by more than half. The corn was light, the ears small and poorly filled. It was a grim business, harvesting a failure. One afternoon, I saw Miller's big new gleaner sitting silent in the middle of a field, his massive grain truck and a dealer's service truck parked beside it. I saw him standing there, his hands on his hips, arguing with the mechanic. Later at the co-op, I heard the story. A sensor in the hydrostatic transmission had failed. It was a tiny electronic part, no bigger than a thumbnail, but it had shut the whole machine down. The part wasn't in stock locally. It had to be flown in from the factory in Illinois. The combine sat idle for 3 days, while a late autumn rainstorm rolled in and flattened what little crop was left. The final bill for the part, the mechanic's time, and the service call was over $2,000. My old John Deere 95 broke down that same week. A bearing went out on the main separator shaft. I heard it start to squeal, shut the machine down immediately, and had it diagnosed in 10 minutes. I drove to town, bought a new bearing for $37, and pressed it on myself. I was back in the field and running before the sun went down. The contrast wasn't lost on the men who gathered around the co-op's coffee pot. They saw Miller, pacing like a caged animal, completely helpless and dependent on a dealer 2 counties away. They saw me, covered in grease but in control, fixing my own problems with my own hands. For the first time, the whispers about Cal Thompson's foolishness began to quiet down, replaced by a grudging respect. That winter, the other shoe dropped. The grain prices, which had been artificially inflated for years, collapsed. The export market dried up. Corn that had been $3 a bushel was now barely fetching $2. It was a perfect storm, a devastatingly poor crop, followed by devastatingly low prices. Farmers were getting hit from both sides. The talk of raising interest rates at the Federal Reserve was no longer just talk. It was policy. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything, began to climb. 8%, 10%, 12%. The polite, smiling banker, Mr. Peterson, wasn't smiling anymore. His letters started arriving in mailboxes all over the county. They were formal, full of words like variable rate, collateral reassessment, and immediate action. The easy credit that had fueled the boom years was gone. The party was over. The winter of 1980 was the quietest I can ever remember. The usual trips to Florida or Arizona didn't happen. The new pickups and Cadillacs stayed in the sheds, replaced by older, more fuel-efficient cars for trips to town. The talk at the diner was hushed, fearful. Men who had been farming for 30 years looked haunted, their faces etched with a kind of despair I'd never seen before. They were land-rich and cash-poor, and the banks were starting to circle. Dale Miller was hit the hardest. He was the most leveraged, the most exposed. His operating note alone was hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the interest rate on it had just doubled. His land payments were astronomical. He put a few of his newer, smaller tractors up for sale, but nobody was buying. Everyone was trying to sell, to raise cash, and there was no money to be had. The foreclosures started in the spring of '81. It began with the younger guys, the ones who had jumped in headfirst at the peak of the market. Their auction notices were tacked to the bulletin board at the courthouse, stark white sheets of paper that felt like death certificates. Each one sent a fresh wave of fear through the community. Miller held on longer than most. He was a fighter, I'll give him that. He sold off his herd of cattle at a loss. He let go of his one hired man. His wife started working as a clerk at the grocery store in town. You'd see him in the field from dawn until long after dusk, his face a grim mask of determination, trying to work his way out from under the mountain of debt. But it was like trying to shovel his way out of an avalanche. The prime rate hit 21%. 21%. It was an impossible, unthinkable number. The interest on his loans was accumulating faster than he could ever hope to pay it down, even with a perfect crop. The bank, which had once praised him as a model of modern agriculture, now saw him as a liability. They called his notes. His auction was scheduled for a cold, grey day in early November of 1982. It was at his home place, the same farm where his father had been born. The atmosphere was the complete opposite of that day at the Henderson sale a decade earlier. There was no excitement, no optimism. The crowd was small and somber, mostly neighbors who had come not to bid, but to bear witness, to pay their respects to a fallen man. The auctioneer's chant sounded hollow, almost apologetic. Miller's equipment, once the pride of the county, sold for pennies on the dollar. That massive Steiger tractor, the one he'd paid over $100,000 for, sold for $30,000 to an out-of-state dealer. The big Gleaner combine went for even less. There was simply no market for it. No one had the cash or the credit to buy. I stood at the back, just as I had all those years ago. I wasn't there to gloat. Seeing a man's life dismantled piece by piece is a terrible thing, no matter who he is. I watched Dale as he stood by the side of his house, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. He looked 10 years older. His confidence, his swagger. It was all gone, stripped away by the brutal math of the economy. My harvest that year had been a good one. I had brought the big Massey out for its first full season. That Perkins V8 engine rumbled to life every morning without fail. The combine was a beast, easily handling the 20-foot grain head I'd bought for it. It was bigger and more powerful than anything I'd ever run, and it allowed me to finish my harvest faster and more efficiently than ever before. While my neighbors were struggling to keep their aging, smaller machines running, I was cruising through my fields. The machine that everyone had called junk was now the most capable combine in a 10-mile radius, and it was mine. It owed no bank a single dime. When the auctioneer got to the land, a heavy silence fell over the crowd. This was the final blow. They started with the outlying parcels first. They sold cheap, for less than half of what Miller had paid for them. The bankers stood grim-faced, watching their collateral evaporate. Finally, Jed, the same auctioneer from the Henderson sale, moved to the last parcel. "All right, folks," he said, his voice lacking its usual energy. "This is the home quarter. 160 acres, with the house, the barns, the bins. A good place. A family home." He looked out at the silent crowd. "What am I bid?" No one spoke. No one moved. To bid on a man's home, in front of him and his family, felt like a violation. The banker conferred with the auctioneer, and Jed spoke again. "Folks, the bank holds the note. We have to have an opening bid. The bank will start the bidding at $400 an acre." It was a fraction of its worth just a few years before, but it was still a lot of money. The silence stretched. I saw Dale's wife turn her head and bury her face in his shoulder. This was it. They were going to lose their home. I thought about my father. I thought about his warnings against debt, his belief in self-reliance. I thought about the years I'd spent in my shop, my hands bloody and stained with grease, while the world called me a fool. And I thought about the money in my savings account, the profits from years of good prices and low expenses, earning steady, patient interest. I took a breath and stepped forward, just as I had done for the combine. My voice cut through the cold air. 410. Every head whipped around to look at me. Dale Miller's head came up, his eyes wide with shock. The banker looked at me, then down at his clipboard, then back at me, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Jed the auctioneer found his voice. "I have 410. Do I hear 420? $410 an acre." He looked around. There were no other bidders. The out-of-state buyers were only interested in the equipment. The neighbors didn't have the money. "Going once," Jed called out. Dale stared at me, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Going twice." I met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of triumph. It was a nod of understanding. "Sold." Jed's gavel cracked. "To Cal Thompson for $410 an acre." I didn't wait for congratulations. I walked straight over to Dale. He stood frozen, his wife still clinging to his arm. He looked like he was trying to find words, but none would come. "Dale," I said quietly, so only he could hear. "It's a good house, a good farm. It ought to stay in the family." He finally found his voice, a choked whisper. "Cal, Why?" "Because nobody should have to see their home sold out from under them," I said. "Look, I don't need to farm this ground. I've got my own. But I need someone to look after it. I'll rent it to you. 1/3 of the crop goes to me for the land. You keep the rest. We'll draw up the papers next week. You and your family can stay right here." Tears welled up in his eyes, the first crack in the dam of his pride. He stuck out a hand that was trembling slightly. "Cal, I don't know what to say." I shook his hand. It was calloused, just like mine. "Don't say anything," I said. Just get some rest. Planting season will be here before you know it." Word of what happened at the Miller auction spread faster than a prairie fire. The narrative in the county changed overnight. I was no longer Cal the fool or Cal the eccentric. I was Cal Thompson, the man who had seen the storm coming. The men who had once smirked at my old tractor now came to me for help. "Cal, my 4020 is losing hydraulic pressure. You got any idea what it could be?" "Cal, the final drive on my 806 is making a noise. Can you take a listen?" My machine shed became a sort of community hospital for ailing equipment. I never charged for my advice, and only asked for what the parts cost if I did the work. On winter evenings, there would be 3 or 4 neighbors in my shop, gathered around the wood stove, drinking coffee and talking. Not about getting bigger, but about getting by. Not about leverage, but about longevity. We talked about how to rebuild a water pump, how to set the timing on a diesel engine, how to weld a cracked frame. The skills my father had taught me, the skills that had been deemed obsolete, were suddenly valuable again. Dale Miller became my best tenant. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce work ethic. He farmed that quarter section like it was the most precious ground on earth. He used his older, smaller equipment that he'd managed to buy back, and when it broke, he'd come over to my shop and we'd fix it together. We never spoke of the past, of his mockery or my silence. We didn't have to. There was an understanding between us, forged in the fire of that crisis. After 5 years of renting, he came to me with a proposal to buy the farm back on contract. I gave him a fair price and a fair interest rate, and by the time the 90s rolled around, the deed was back in his name. I never got married, never had kids of my own. The farm was my family, the machines my children. I kept farming my 320 acres, and I kept running that Massey Ferguson 760. Over the years, I modified it, improved it. I added a better monitoring system in the cab, rebuilt the unloading auger, and put bigger tires on it. It was an old machine, but it was a good one. Every fall, when I'd climb into that cab and turn the key, that Perkins V8 would rumble to life, a familiar and reassuring sound. It was the sound of my own independence. My sister's boy, young Tom, started hanging around the farm when he was a teenager. He was a good kid, smart and curious, with a natural feel for machinery. He wasn't like the other kids who only cared about video games and computers. He liked the smell of grease and diesel. One warm autumn evening, years later, I was getting the combine ready for the next day. Tom, now a young man learning the farm from me, was helping. The machine sat there under the yard light, its yellow paint faded, its steel bearing the scars of 30 harvests. It looked old, but it looked strong. "Uncle Cal," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Why have you kept this old thing all these years? You could have afforded a new one a long time ago." I stopped what I was doing and looked at the combine. I didn't see a machine. I saw an auction, a burnt-out wreck, and a laughing crowd. I saw years of cold nights in the shop, my knuckles bleeding. I saw a banker's condescending smile and a neighbor's despair. I saw a lesson, paid for in sweat and solitude. "This machine isn't just about harvesting corn, Tom," I said, patting the huge front tire. "It's about what's real. This steel is real. The engine is real. The work it takes to keep it running is real. Debt. That's not real. It's just numbers on a piece of paper. It's a promise you make to a banker about a future that you can't control." "This machine," I said, my voice growing quiet, "it doesn't run on promises. It runs on diesel fuel and hard work. You can always count on that." He was quiet for a long time, just looking at the old combine, at the story written in its dents and welds. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I think I get it," he said. I smiled and handed him a grease gun. "Good," I said. "Now let's make sure she's ready for tomorrow." We worked together under the single light, the chirping of the crickets the only sound in the cool night air. The massive combine stood silent, a faithful giant waiting for the dawn, a monument not to foolishness, but to a different kind of wealth, the kind you can't spend and the bank can never take away.